Привіт, це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Моє ім'я Наталка Гуменюк, і зі мною тут
Ангеліна Кирякіна. Привіт. І привіт, Наталко. Говоримо сьогодні про твого гостя, про людину, яка розбирається у питаннях війни, і до якого є, звісно, величезна кількість питань стосовно перспектив цієї війни. Американський історик та аналітик Phillips O'Brien. Скажи, будь ласка, де ти з ним зустрілася і чому саме ти вирішила записати з ним цю розмову?
Phillips O'Brien дійсно історик, який досліджує сучасні воїни, і я мала змогу модерувати з ним дискусію українського заходу під час Всесвітнього економічного форуму в Давосі, який стосувався, зокрема, воїн, того, як ведеться війна, але я знайома була з ним ще раніше. Він буває в Україні і дуже багато пише, зокрема, про війну Росії проти України для видання «Атлантик». Зокрема, він не просто досліджує війни ХХ століття, але досліджує стратегії воєн. І чимало його статей викликали великий інтерес мій, зокрема, про те, як вигравати війни. Чим особливо українська війна, він робив велику кількість також аналітичних матеріалів про те, чому є дуже багато нерозумінь в Заходу щодо російської війни проти України, чого не розуміють політики, завдяки чому війни виграють. Він зараз викладає в університеті Сент-Ендрюса в Шотландії, вже багато років живе у Великій Британії, є сам американцем. І він є таким апологетом того, що єдина причина, чому Україна не може швидше перемогти в своїй війні проти Росії, тому що політики не розуміють, що війни можна виграти, що війни проти великих країн виграти можна, якщо тільки дати все потрібне. І от, власне, він постійно упродовж років дає там в різних своїх аналітичних матеріалах, пише, потрібно те. Отут ви не зрозуміли те. І я давно з ним хотіла поговорити, але, окрім того, він таким є яскравим, емоційним голосом, який дуже критикує зараз, зокрема, і адміністрацію Дональда Трампа про припинення реальної допомоги Україні і підтримки, скажімо так, переходу з статусу союзника на статус, зараз, напевно, не буду навіть давати визначення, який статус ми можемо зараз дати Сполученим Штатам у наших відносинах і у нашій війні проти Росії. І тому дуже, звісно, хотілося поговорити про нього. Особливо тому, що останні його матеріали присвячені тому, а що мусить робити Європа.
Зазвичай твої розмови, вони так чи інакше оптимістичні, тобто ти виводиш не те, щоб там оптимістичні, ми всі віримо в світле майбутнє, це конструктивна журналістика рішень. Ти питаєш про рішення. Враховуючи, що ви говорили після рішення адміністрації Трампа припинити нам, Україні, військову допомогу з боку США, які прогнози твого співрозмовника, наскільки вони є оптимістичними? Чи думає він про те, що нам треба шукати інші шляхи, чи просто чекати і працювати на те, щоб ситуація змінилась?
Філіпс якраз цього разу був, скажімо так, емоційнішим, ніж завжди, і в такому дуже злому, я би сказала, настрої по відношенню до того, що відбувається. Він наполягав на тому, що не потрібні ніякі ілюзії. Ви, звісно, можете вкладатися дуже багато відновлення відносин зі Сполученими Штатами, але забудьте, єдина ваша надія – це Європа. І я дуже багато запитувала про те, а що можна замінити? Зокрема, що можна замінити на полі бою? А що таке стратегія воїн? А чи може країна, яка опинилася, скажімо так, поміж великими країнами, виграти, протриматися? Чи є якісь історичні приклади? Але я би так сказала, я раджу всім послухати, як він відповідає на всі запитання детально. Вони, чесно кажучи, такі дуже актуалізовані, як на наш подкаст. Вони про і відносини Трампа з Росією, і як він все це трактує, і що може зробити Європа, і як склалося так в оборонному секторі, що Європа настільки залежна від Сполучених Штатів, що деякі там деталі, деякі технології, їх, в принципі, неможливо насправді замінити. Я ставила такого роду питання, Але, скажімо так, його висновок, він постійно повертався до цього, що якщо не збереться до купи, та, і якщо всі разом не почнуть захищатися, то там нам кінець, умовно кажучи. Я кажу не про нас, я кажу про світ.
Це радше типу заклик був, да, з його боку, ніж оцінка. Ну що, не будемо більше спойлерити, які саме він прогнози дає, які саме оцінки, що саме важливо тримати в голові. Давайте слухати розмову Наталки Гуменюк з Філіпсом О'Брайеном.
І я нагадаю, що відтепер ми просимо вашої підтримки, якщо ви хочете далі слухати наш подкаст, а ми хочемо його робити. А в нас немає якогось окремого специфічного фінансування для нашої чудової команди, яка допомагає робити його можливим. Тому ви можете в коментарях до платформ, також на сайті лабораторії, дізнатися реквізити, і як підтримуєте, ми за все будемо вдячні. Тому просимо підтримати і надсилати ваші донати для нашого подкасту.
Я би хотіла подякувати всім, хто кожного разу каже нам і особисто, і в коментарях: класний подкаст, робіть ще, нам дуже цікаво. Це момент, коли я хочу вас попросити підкріпити це своє прохання невеличкою підтримкою, такою, яка є для вас прийнятною, враховуючи, скільки ми всі зараз ініціатив, зрозуміло яких, в першу чергу на підтримку наших Збройних сил виділяємо. Але це дійсно робота не лише наша з Наталкою, а і робота нашої невеличкої, але дуже крутої команди, нашої редакторки Іри, нашої звукорежисерки Люби. Ви можете знайти реквізити лабораторії журналістики суспільного інтересу на нашому сайті journallab.online. Будемо вам вдячні.
Phillips, I was very much interested to talk to you as somebody who is researching the strategy of the war, but we are in a very special moment. And I really want to ask you first, how would you describe what's now is going on with the U.S. stand on the war against Ukraine?
The U.S. has changed sides. I mean, that's clearly what has happened. It sadly was predictable with Donald Trump. People didn't want to admit that that's what he was going to do, but that was what he wanted to do, what always wanted to do. So the U.S. is no longer to be considered a friend of Ukraine, or no longer to be considered a friend of its NATO allies. I wouldn't even consider the U.S. an ally anymore if I was in NATO, in the sense that I don't think any European country could expect the U.S. to defend them at this point. And if anything, Trump is closer to Putin than he is to any other European leader. He seems to want to get Putin as good a deal as possible out of this war. And so it really is a thing which people have to now be honest about. I don't think people were honest about what he was going to do because they didn't want to believe it. Denying now.
But why? What is your take? What is the reason, beyond like Trump has a sympathy?
Yeah, I mean, he's always liked Putin. He's always, been sympathetic to Russia. This goes back to when he was actually anti-NATO in the 80s. He's been drawn to Russia. He's always liked Putin. He's liked to do business there. He likes dictators. By nature, he likes authoritarians. So he speaks very highly of President Xi in China. He speaks very highly of the North Korean dictators. He just doesn't like democracy. To him, it's not that interesting. He wants to be a strongman dictator. So it's just that's his natural milieu. He's always he dislikes Ukrainians. He believes Ukraine didn't help him on the Hunter Biden laptop. I mean, nonsense like this, but he believes that the Ukrainians didn't help him on the Hunter Biden laptop. He has absolutely bought the Russian propaganda line. When he said a few weeks ago he didn't know if Ukraine would exist in a few years, he was being honest from his point of view. So he has been very heavily influenced by Putin and the Russian view.
So look, before we go to a lot of questions, what we do with this, what we, are we capable to fight without the American support? And even when the US are on kind of aiding Russia, or what Europe should do, all kind of obvious questions. You have incredible analysis. So you researching strategies of war, and before with some people who might not have read some of your articles and analysis, which I encourage to read, I want to really explain, how would you explain how the wars could be won? Because what I find it interesting that now it's very easy to be swayed by this kind of propaganda and this narrative, which is really can be very destructive and damaging, that which is also Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and everybody's pushing. If you're a smaller country, there is no chance for you. That's what they're trying to do. So before we go to the kind of details, can you reassure us, how actually wars are won, why they are won, who have chances? So I want to start with your basics.
People get wars wrong all the time. I mean, we can go back to what people were saying in February 2022 as the foundation of wrongness and go from there. What were they saying? That Russia would conquer Ukraine in a few days. And that was true, by the way. That was believed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States Armed Forces. So the most senior soldier in the United States with access to all the intelligence resources of the U.S. government. A really massive intelligence operation said Kyiv would fall in a few days. Basically, Ukraine wouldn't last more than a few weeks was the assumption, or at least all of eastern Ukraine would be seized in a few weeks. And that shows, I think, a real fundamental problem about war to begin with. Wars are hardly ever short, decided in the early stages by, battles that are decisive. That almost, everyone thinks war will be like that. War will be over by Christmas, and they're almost always wrong. In fact, wars are very rarely, if ever, won or lost by the forces that are on hand when they start. The forces that you have on hand when you start a war almost always prove to be wholly inadequate to fight the war as it goes on. You need so much more stuff. I mean, if you go back to what Ukraine and Russia had at the beginning of the war, it's all gone at this point. Or almost all the shells have been used up. All the, everything that they had, all the tanks from that point are gone. The Russians are probably on their third or fourth army by this point. I mean, they really just, raised armies, seen them destroyed, raised armies, seen them destroyed. So wars are won and lost through a process of generating new force and destroying the force on the other side to the degree that one of the sides no longer can keep the war going for either political or military reasons. You can be a smaller power and win that. That's the odd thing about this. Oh, Russia's so big. The United States saying that is so stupid because the United States loses the Vietnam War. The United States lost the war in Afghanistan. The United States has lost plenty of wars to smaller powers because ultimately the cost of pursuing the war becomes one that isn't worth keeping up. And that, by the way, is the general story of when smaller powers win. So Ukraine always had a chance to win. And Russia, by the way, isn't that strong. That's the thing about Russia, which I always found incredibly frustrating before the full-scale invasion. There's people saying, well, Russia is a great power. Russia's going to conquer Ukraine in 3 days. The Russian economy is smaller than Canada and larger than Spain's. It's somewhere at that level. It's like a medium-level European economy, and it's not terribly technologically advanced. So it's not like, how many Russian high-tech goods do you have? So the idea that somehow the Russian economy, or Russia was a great power, was just nonsense. It's a mid-ranking power with a massive corruption problem. And that people were saying, and still, by the way, remains that. It's economically, it cannot make much of what it's losing. So it can't make more tanks than it's losing. It cannot make more armored personnel carriers than it's losing. So the Russians are actually slowly running out of equipment because they can't make up their losses in certain key areas. So what Ukraine has to do, it's not pretty, because of the way we've chosen to arm Ukraine. We've forced Ukraine to fight quite a limited war with Western weapons. I mean, the Ukrainians have developed a lot of their own, but they haven't developed the long-range weapons with the effectiveness of, say, U.S. weapons. We forced the Ukrainians to fight an attritional battlefront war. That can still be won, but it needs to be won by inflicting heavy casualties on the Russians while keeping Ukrainian casualties down. So basically, war is a process of force regeneration, force destruction, and the key thing is that don't look at what you have to start a war. Look what you can make during that war.
Thanks to what and how the wars are won?
Well, basically, they're won because one side runs out of the ability to keep making equipment and deciding to deploy it. I mean, how will the war be run against Russia? The war could be won against Russia because by the end of 2025, they will run out of the ability to replace the equipment they've lost. Okay, I mean, it's not pretty at all, but basically they will start running out of vehicles and artillery pieces unless, say, the Chinese step in and provide a great deal. This is if Ukraine is armed. If Ukraine is supported by its partners, it can lead to a production and equipment crisis for the Russians by the end of 2025, which basically means the Russian ability to keep combat operations going would be compromised. Now, that can't happen unless Ukraine is also supported. That is the key element to it. So wars are won when one side loses the ability eventually to keep producing the weapons to replace those being lost, or they politically lose the will to keep going. So, I mean, either side in this war could politically decide to end it at a certain point. I think Putin could be overthrown and a new Russian leadership could come in. Why Putin and Trump are trying to get rid of Zelensky is because they want to have a Ukrainian election which they can pervert and then bring in a government that they believe would actually agree to their demands. So they have a political strategy to basically say to the Ukrainians, stop fighting. But that's why they're so obsessed with an election, is because they believe they can politically get Ukraine out of a war that way.
Still on the February 24th, you wrote an article to The Atlantic, which is called Trump Sided with Putin, What Should Europe Do Now? So what should Europe do now, especially today, when we have a clearly feeling, knowledge, understanding that also the Americans just can be on a different side. They are not just withdrawing support.
Well, basically, they need to treat Ukraine as a full member of the European family of nations and treat Ukrainian security as their security and Ukraine's future as a European future. That up until now, why Ukraine has been kept out of NATO, for instance, and not given an entry pathway is that the United States didn't want it. That was under Biden. The Biden administration did not want to approve a Ukrainian pathway into NATO. Nowadays, now with the U.S. out of the picture, that becomes redundant. I mean, Europeans, I think, have to understand that Ukraine becomes then the key frontline state for European security. That you need, the way that Ukraine goes will make a massive difference to the future of Europe. So what Europe has to do is to have an immediate plan to get Ukraine into the EU. What is the step-by-step process? They need to set up, in essence, a European NATO. So a NATO kind of alliance for just European states, because you need the UK and that and Norway that aren't in the EU. And you've got to get Ukraine integrated into both of those structures. The immediate thing they have to do is make sure they both make and can hand over to Ukraine enough equipment to keep the Ukrainian military supplied while the Europeans themselves gear up. I also believe the Europeans should start sending forces into Ukraine. They should do things like air defense in Western Ukraine. You could do things without going to the combat line, which would show the Ukraine their commitment. One would be air defense in Western Ukraine. You could do training. I also think they need to consider things like air patrol. There is a very real problem that is going to be in Ukraine's future with the U.S. cutting off aid, and that, as many people know, will be the lack of Patriot missiles. The Patriots are made by the United States, and it's unlikely Ukraine is going to be able to get its hands on many more Patriot anti-air missiles. So actually, one of the only ways to keep the Russians from using their more effective missiles on Ukraine, which have been shot down by the Patriots, is to use European air operations. So these all have to be considered because Ukraine has to be considered now the central front for the future of European security.
My question to you as a historian, how kind of common that this is a case when an ally within like a short period of time is just changing side or withdrawing clearly military support, these kind of things, more or less stopping the heavy weapon on the Polish border, like these kind of examples. Is it like the things which have happened within century?
It's happened more than we understand. It just hasn't happened for a while. So if you look back in the First World War, Italy changes sides in the first year. So in 1914, Italy is supposed to be an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The war breaks out. The Italians go, well, we're not going to actually fight for Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then in early 1915, they switch sides and go to war against Germany and Austria-Hungary with the British and the French. So there are examples of allies like that doing a sort of switch change of sides. You've also, you could say the Nazi-Soviet pact was an example of allies changing sides both ways, so that Hitler and Stalin become allies in 1939, and then in 1941, Hitler attacks Stalin. So you can go through these things. In many ways, I think the Nazi-Soviet pact is not a bad way to look at what Putin and Trump are doing. I'm not trying to say either of them is Hitler, though actually you could make a case, but that they're basically reaching a dictator's agreement, or at least in Trump's case, a wannabe dictator's agreement about what should happen. So these kinds of agreements are sadly not uncommon in history. It's just they haven't happened in a while, so people might not be aware of them.
For the last 30, 40 years, after the Second World War?
We've gone through a very weird period. That's another thing in terms of history, that with the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States had a period of global hegemony that arguably has not been matched before. So, yes, the British were a huge global power, but they were never able to, say, dominate other powers like the United States. And other countries have been very, very large regional powers, but didn't dominate the globe, like the Roman Empire or even the Mongol Empire. The United States, however, after 1991, was globally dominant as a military force. There was nothing that could really compare to it. But that was weird. And that's not normal. And I think people didn't quite understand how abnormal that was. The reason there wasn't a lot of alliance changing was the U.S. was so dominant. And it had this alliance structure with NATO, with its Asian allies, with its position in the Western Hemisphere. And people assumed that would keep going, at least for the foreseeable future. And it might have kept going longer than it has now, but Trump is basically ending it.
So I still would think, what is your take on opportunity to substitute the U.S. weapon and the U.S. military support? Because I heard a lot for quite some time that there is something which is hard to substitute. People were speaking about intelligence, heavyweight, which I don't understand what it is when I forgot. Then I Google again and to learn. But what are the things which is impossible to substitute? Because then I think, can they buy that things, maybe? What is so important about the U.S.?
Well, like-for-like substitution in certain areas are very hard. The Patriots were one of the things. So the most advanced Ukrainian anti-aircraft systems, or the Patriot missiles, they are built by an American company, and the United States controls the supply of their missiles. So once Ukraine runs out of the Patriots it now has, it is unlikely to get any more, because the U.S. controls the supplies. And the Europeans don't have a system nearly as good. They don't have one with the effectiveness of a Patriot system. Because that's one of the problems Europeans have faced, is they've often been buying U.S. systems over the past 40 years than making their own, because it was easier for them to buy them. So that kind of thing just can't be replaced with an equivalent system. Now, you can try to replace it with different capabilities. As I said, you might have to use European aircraft to try and shoot down the Russian aircraft launching those missiles. Or you might have to give, which Frederick Merz said he would do if the war kept going, you might have to give Ukraine Tauruses. And Tauruses can be used to attack the air bases from which those aircraft are launched. So you're going to have to think about using different kinds of European capabilities instead of the Patriots, and they probably won't be as good or as efficient as the Patriots. Other things that will be trouble are 155 millimeter ammunition plus the artillery tubes needed to fire that. A lot of war is quite boring. It's about logistics. It's about maintenance. And as this war has been so heavily artillerized, especially in the first few years, you can burn through artillery barrels. And the United States is a country that provides a lot of those artillery barrels and a lot of those shells. There's the intelligence. The United States has been providing a huge amount of intelligence to Ukrainian targeting to tell them what to hit. So there's these kinds of capabilities that have only come from the U.S. that will be very hard to, or impossible to make up in a like-for-like basis. It's whether you could compensate for them with something different. In some cases, not as good. In some cases, just a different way of thinking about the issue. Say when it comes to intelligence, the French are offering to step in. Now, French intelligence will not be as effective as U.S. intelligence, but it might help a little bit. In many ways, the best way to compensate for the withdrawal of U.S. support is for the Europeans to take the reins off the Ukraine. The United States has actually been limiting Ukraine while it's been helping it. So they've been very careful when they've given Ukraine weapons to try and do things to keep Ukraine from, in their mind, expanding the war, say, into Russia. The Biden administration is desperately afraid of the war expanding into Russia because they were afraid of two things. They were afraid of escalation and they were afraid of a Russian collapse. The Biden administration did not want the Russian regime to collapse. Therefore, they were trying to limit the war, you might say, to Ukraine, to Ukrainian territory, as a way of limiting the escalation and Russian collapse possibilities. Well, Europe, as I mentioned, they could give more of they can give the Tauruses and allow them to be fired into Russia, which would be an absolute change in the way that the Ukrainians have been able to engage. Or they could give better systems on the freaking aircraft that everyone, the F-16s, the problem with the F-16s is that the Americans made sure the Ukrainians got the worst possible F-16s. So they're very short radar. They didn't give them the long-range, most up-to-date radar. And therefore, the Ukrainian F-16s can't actually engage with Russian aircraft that far out because they can't detect them. They're an earlier generation radar. What the Europeans have to start doing is that's why it's actually good in some ways they're getting French aircraft. Or hopefully maybe Swedish aircraft. Because at this point, I wouldn't trust the U.S. to give anything. So you're going to have to get your hands on better European systems than so far you've been given.
But something I want also like to clarify, because I had a couple of talks already, that indeed there are some of the type of the weapon that even if it's produced in Sweden or if it's produced in Europe, it's very hard to substitute some of the details. Or, for instance, you can't really buy because the Americans also sell things to the partners. So, for instance, it's not like you just can come and say like, okay, we pay you, we're buying that. So how dependent to your understanding is really the European, let's say?
That's why the Europeans have to think creatively across the line and start making their own stuff. I mean, they can do certain areas, by the way. I think they can make an area that they could really help is expanding Ukrainian UAV production and capabilities. As well as I do, the huge transformation in this war in the past 3 years, has been the growth of UAVs. So that now UAVs are doing 70% of the killing and destroying on the battle line. They're not being done by artillery. They're not being done by tanks or the old legacy systems. Most of the destruction on the battlefield is being done by UAVs. Now, Ukraine has had a great success in building up its own UAV system. And what Europe can do is try and supercharge this. It can work with the Ukrainians to keep growing UAV production because Europe has production capabilities. They could do things. Europe can produce a lot of engines, which could be used in UAVs, so that there could be elements where basically they wouldn't have to rely on the U.S., but that they can rely on their own innate production capabilities and what they can develop.
One of your articles, still written like autumn 2023, was about what Ukraine knows about the future of war, more or less explaining what experience Ukrainians gained. A lot has been gained since then, but beyond UAV, beyond the drones, maybe you just explain what actually is new about this war.
In some ways, of course, the lessons of the war were ones that would have been understandable to those in the Second World War and whatever. I mean, that if you're going to fight an army like the Russian army, the key thing is not to batter your head against it. You're not to attack defensive lines, defensive fortifications, which, by the way, the U.S. Army didn't like to do in the Second World War. What you want to do is collapse it from behind and attack its logistics, attack it at range. I mean, I wrote that article, I think it was in early 2023, where I said we're arming Ukraine all wrong for the counteroffensive. What we're doing is just wrong because we're arming Ukraine to attack the Russian lines, which we would never do. The United States would never do that. The United States would go over the Russian lines and basically collapse it from behind. They would attack all the logistics, everything supplying that army. So when they actually ended up attacking that army directly, that army would have been starved of equipment. and it would have been starved of supplies and wouldn't be nearly as functional. And that lesson, by the way, is not a new lesson. What's weird is we chose not to allow Ukraine to benefit by it. And we tried to force them to fight this direct head-on confrontational war. The Ukrainians have learned the lesson that that's really hard to do, almost impossible, and it's getting more difficult because of the growth of UAV technology. I think, what is the difference? What does that mean, the growth of UAV technology? It means the battlefield is increasingly transparent. You can't hide on it. That once a vehicle comes out now, it can be discovered in minutes, seconds, if UAVs are in the air. And that changes the whole idea of moving forward. That, if you're talking about, everyone was excited about the Russian BTGs in 2022. The BTGs now look ridiculous, ludicrous, because they basically were lots of vehicles with no protection. Where now, they'd be eaten up by they'd be eaten up by UAVs now. The process of destroying the Russian army is understood, and it would be to collapse it from behind. The technology to partially do that has changed because of the enormous proliferation of UAVs.
There is this phrase I like a lot. It's a quote by the Taiwanese Admiral Lee Si-ming, when he said that, if we can't defeat them, we have to defeat their mission. You already discussed how the wars could be won, but at this particular stage, because we are in very, let's say, a moment of particular anxiety. I'm talking to you from Kyiv. I do understand how emotionally difficult it's for people. But what is at this stage the mission Ukrainians can defeat, if you really speak about the Russian mission, more or less in foreseeable future? I'm speaking about months, half a year, because it really can evoke very fast some of the actions by the White House and the others.
The key thing for the Ukrainians is to damage the Russians and keep their own losses down. That's the thing in the short, right? That has to be the way they fight. Don't do anything stupid. Don't take any risks. Don't expose your troops going forward. Fight the war where you're basically make the Russians come to you and destroy them as they come to you. Because it has to be a situation. Ukraine's issue will be numbers of soldiers going forward. That's going to be having the equipment isn't going to be quite the problem going forward. The Ukraine is producing so many UAVs. The problem will be, do we have enough UAV pilots? Yeah, because there's going to be more UAVs than UAV pilots. They're going to be able to be flown. So Ukraine has to protect its numbers of soldiers. And it has to fight a war in such a way that it keeps that number of soldier losses as small as possible while extracting the greatest loss ratio on the Russians. And it has to do that while waiting for the Europeans to gear up and to start providing the Ukrainians with some of the things the Americans will deprive them of.
If we speak about Europe, I also hear various thoughts, because there are also, of course, concern that, yes, Europeans, talking well, the address of Emmanuel Macron was really strong, and we hear some voices, very, very clear voices in various European countries. But the concern is then if Trump pushes the Europeans and really tell them, no, if you support Ukraine, that's what you will get. That would be your punishment for that. Tariff, whatsoever, other kind of threats, and definitely won't defend itself. Do you really think that the Europeans understand that the U.S. might not defend them?
Oh, I think hopefully they understand. I mean, they didn't want to accept that until the last few days. The number one European default system for the last few years is don't do anything to get the U.S. upset, because ultimately we need NATO. And they would have sacrificed Ukraine for NATO. They already were, in a way, sacrificing Ukraine for NATO, because no European state wanted to jeopardize America's commitment to NATO. So they were always going along with the Biden administration, even if they didn't like what the Biden administration wanted. So that states like the Baltics, some of the Nordics, Poland, would have liked to give Ukraine better capacities than Ukraine was getting, but they wouldn't do it because they were afraid of offending the USA. All right. So Biden both helped Ukraine, but limited the kind of aid Ukraine got. Now Trump is just giving no aid and helping Putin. If the Europeans decide not to help Ukraine to appease Trump at this point, they've lost their minds. It literally means they do not understand the situation in which they are in, that they are going for fantasy land where Trump might defend them. I think now they understand that's not possible. The real test, though, will be almost certainly Friedrich Merz in Germany. That Merz has said some very interesting things in the last few days. If the Germans really pull the stops off the debt brakes and spend $800 billion on defense and infrastructure, you can be sure that they now understand the U.S. will not defend them and cannot be relied upon, and that Europe will have to look after itself. So in some ways, it will be follow the money. If they start spending the money, they understand the reality. If they don't spend any money, then they're really hoping to go back.
My way out from anxiety is always understand and to see the examples because sometimes if you're in a position, let's say even sometimes of the victim, in this regard, I would say a victim of a betrayal, you kind of feel very much pity about themselves. I also want to tell you that what I know from talking to some of the military or to the people who talk to the Ukrainian military, people go on working. They're kind of pretty calm and doing what they need to do. But of course, among the circle in Kyiv, in political circle, of course, you're trying to figure out what's going on. In the history of wars, recent wars, how common is this kind of situation where we are now? When you have two of these big powers, more or less creating an alliance, but you're still trying to, I won't even say fight back, but hold on and continue because you know that you're doing the right thing.
Well, in some ways, of course, not, because the U.S. and Russia were opposed during the Cold War and not friendly afterwards. Though Russia isn't a great power. I think that's the issue with that analysis is Russia is defeatable as a power. It's just not that strong economically. It's actually not that strong militarily. It's had enormous military advantages in being able to attack everything in Ukraine. Well, Ukraine hasn't been able to attack it. But the Russian military is a defeatable military by what we would call military standards. It's a question of whether Ukraine is going to be provided in the right way to defeat that military. So it's not like Russia and the U.S. being allied. If the U.S. goes full in for Russia, then Europe will lose. I mean, the U.S. is more militarily powerful. But that means it would have to go to war with Europe, and it's unlikely to do that. Because Trump is not going to, I think, fight a war with Europe. And I don't think you could actually get that through Congress. So it's not going to be an alliance where they have joint military forces and fight Europe. It's more that what happens is the U.S. becomes a supporter of Russia, gives it some intelligence, things like that, cuts off Ukraine entirely, cuts off Europe entirely. And Trump's assumption at that point is Ukraine will lose. I think he's absolutely wrong on that. I think they've bought a lot of the bad reporting of the last year. The reporting in the West in the last year has been appalling. And it's all been about Ukraine. If you read the Western press for the last year, Ukraine was always about to collapse. It's been actually irresponsible that the reporting has all been about, Ukraine is having morale crisis. Ukraine, the soldiers don't want to fight. The Russians are advancing inexorably. And you can find that in the Financial Times, the Washington Post, the Economist. They all have this regular stories. Now, Trump actually believes that. That's why he says, Ukraine has no cards.
Well, why do you think is that? Is it something in the psycho of the media? I'm a journalist myself, that you need to be critical about what's going on.
No, there's a few things going on. I mean, one, I've done a big report on Elliot Cohen Elliot and I wrote a report on the failure of the analysis before the Russian invasion, the full-scale invasion. And I think a lot of the analytical community wants to make the Russian military better than they are to try and explain their bad analysis. So there's an inbuilt pro-Russian bias in the analytical community. They were talking about how amazing the Russian military was before February 24th, 2022. That was their bread and butter. To go on and say the Russian military is great, it's going to overrun the Ukrainians. And therefore, by the way, they're all Russian military analysts. No one in the West called themselves a Ukrainian military analyst. They were Russian military analysts. Now they say, well, I'm a military analyst, but they were Russianists. And I think that has basically, and they've often set the narrative, is it came from a Moscow-centric understanding of war. And so there was an attempt to justify that. I think there's also, by the way, a fundamental misunderstanding of what war is. People are writing about Touretsk as a strategic city. It isn't. They want any kind of advance on a map to mean something, even the tiniest advance. The story of 2024 was not the story of Russian advances. The story of 2024 is the story of relative losses on both sides versus what they can make. The amount of land that changed hands in 2024 was tiny. The Russians took about 1% of Ukraine. Okay, that's it. 1% of Ukraine is about all they took in 2024. And as you take away the part of Kursk that the Ukrainians occupy, that 1% gets less than 1%. This land is not in and of itself going to change the course of the war. But the reporters like these, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, or Pokrovsk. People were writing in August, Pokrovsk was about to fall in this great strategic Russian victory. Big stories in The Economist and the Financial Times that Pokrovsk might decide the war and it's about to fall. It was all just nonsense because people don't understand war. The story should be, okay, what are Russian loss rates versus what can Russia make? What are Ukrainian loss rates versus what Ukraine can produce? And that will tell you far more important things about the war than who controls a shell of a town that has basically been destroyed.
On Trump, I think people are not any longer fascinated wherever the world are in news about Trump doing great deals, because if to remember his deal with Taliban, it was like 100% troops withdrawal for more or less nothing. He just agreed for the withdrawal of the troops for nothing. So that was his deal. But now I want to really understand, what was first? Of course, there is this fascination with Russia. And there are two schools of thoughts, let's say like that. The first is like, he wants a deal to praise that how great he is, a peacekeeper, I'll get this Nobel Peace Prize. And, of course, from the first kind of days when I had a chance to talk to the people in Washington, some of the smart ones from the former, Trump team also said, he'll try to do that. It won't work with Russia, so he'll need to find somebody to blame, and he'll blame Zelensky and Ukraine. I just didn't expect it to be that kind of rush and that brutal. So he wants a deal whatsoever, and any deal for him is, the success, forcing Ukraine into that. But then the second kind of story have come out that maybe he actually didn't care about the deal about Ukraine. He cares more about renewing the relations with Russia. And Ukraine is an obstacle. So he needed to give up Ukraine and just to maintain, for instance, the relations with Russia for all this kind of idea, to separate Russia from China, for instance, which is definitely nonsense. So what is your take, or maybe both things are there?
Well, no, I mean, what would he have loved? He would love to have gotten Putin the best peace deal possible, but yet be able to sell a deal and say he gets a Nobel Prize. So he would have loved both, all right? He would have loved to have had the deal which gives Putin what Putin wants, because he likes Putin, he wants to work with Putin, he wants a close relationship with Russia, but he would have loved if that had gone along with a deal which would also get him a Nobel Prize. But if chosen between Ukraine and Russia in a deal, he was always going to choose Russia. He was never going to care about getting Ukraine a deal because he doesn't want to. I mean, he's been trying to get, as I talked about it, their view, I actually think they wouldn't, his administration, many of them wouldn't mind if Ukraine ceases to exist. Okay. And that's why he actually came out and said that. I don't know if Ukraine will exist in a few years. It's why he's always been pushing the election. He's always been trying to get rid of Zelensky, not because he hates Zelensky, but he does hate Zelensky, but because what I think they believe is if Ukraine has an election, they can corrupt it. They can do what they did in Romania. They can try and corrupt the Ukrainian elections, lead to internal instability, and basically a collapse in Ukrainian ability to resist. So he's always going to side with Russia. Always, always, always. And he was never going to side with Ukraine. It's just if Ukraine had rolled over, then he could have gotten a Nobel Prize with it. He would have been happy. But I just hated when people saying he would get Ukraine a good deal. He was never going to get Ukraine a good deal.
What does he want to Russia? And I want to understand also the issue with China. Because on the one hand, China is kind of like a new great adversary. And then, yes, you want to separate Russia, which is totally dependent on Beijing. And obviously, with the reason, Putin should trust Beijing more than Donald Trump, honestly, because there is more reason and he's more trustful and is more necessary in this regard. So I don't see how that can play out, the cooperation with Russia and the US against Beijing. But at the same time, you also think but Trump also kind of like president of China. And, yes, there is Taiwan, but in the end, probably they would better have the situation in which you really create something the Russians want. So the world where there are Chinese, Russians, and the Americans deciding.
Yeah, the anti-China stuff is just show. He's not anti-China. He actually is not sending any more U.S. military forces to the Pacific. He's not preparing the U.S. to defend U.S. allies in Asia. He's certainly not going to fight for Taiwan. He praises President Xi all the time. He wants business deals with China. The anti-China stuff is just politics. There's also, I call it the China con. And the idea that they care about detaching Russia from China, first of all, they can't do it because the Chinese control everything in the Russian economy now. Putin can't actually afford to antagonize China because he doesn't have a single soldier on the Chinese border. The Russians have all their soldiers in Ukraine. 90% of their armed forces are in Ukraine. So they can't have an antagonistic relationship with China even if they wanted one, which they don't. So the idea of detaching Russia from China is just made up excuses to try and justify why he wants to cooperate with Russia. And the fact is, he just is pro-Russian. He wants to cooperate with Putin. He's not doing it because of China. He'd actually, as you say, probably more likely have a tripartite deal. U.S., Russia, and China get together and have their different spheres of interest. Who he's really threatening with conflict are Denmark and Canada. So he's threatening Greenland and he's threatening Canadian sovereignty. He's not threatening China.
What is the role of Europe in his world then?
Everyone should be Viktor Orban. I mean, that's what J.D. Vance actually said at the Munich Security Conference. They want right-wing populists to take over Europe. They wanted the AfD to take over.
And then they would be the allies back.
Well, no, then they would just simply do what they want. I mean, they ultimately don't want strong alliances with anyone in Europe. They don't want NATO, but they want right-wing governments they can oppress their people with together and basically end liberal democracy.
What is a lesson for the world, for the other countries, what they could do now and see, and also how historic is this shift? Really, how historic is that?
Well, I mean, for the rest of the world, I don't know what to say. All I could say is what Europe should do. And Europe has to, and I think it is, Europe has to wake up and realize it's on its own. No one's going to help it. No, there's no big brother coming to Europe's rescue. Either Europe will defend itself or it will fail. And that's the lesson. Europe is facing reality. And the reality is no more NATO, no more US. It's up to Europe if they wish to look after themselves, or they could fail. I hope Europe does look after itself. I live in Europe. This is my home, and I want it to succeed. So that's the lesson for Europe. For the rest of the world, I don't know. I find that impossible to say. In terms of historic, yes, this is historic. Even if you have another shift back to an Atlanticist president in 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, it's unlikely you can ever reconstruct the U.S. alliance system. And nor should Europeans ever trust it again. If the U.S. is now showing the ability to quickly junk the NATO and move closer to Russia, even in the future, if they have a pro-European president, should Europeans trust this? No. So this is historic. You might say this is the end of the post-1945 world. The post-1945 world, which was the U.S. as a leader of different alliance groupings of states from Asia to Europe, which it felt it had common cause with, that's gone. And we're in a far more chaotic world, and we're certainly in a world where Europe has to look after itself.
What is historic role of Ukraine in this regard? How you see Ukraine in this kind of thing? For what's going on also with the Ukrainian response at this moment? Because I think there would be some kind of discussion. There would be something about this, deal, which is such a minor thing, I should say. I'm speaking about the mineral deal.
The mineral deal is nonsense. I mean, again, the mineral deal was basically a nonsense. It's a nothing burger, as I said. Yeah, it was used by Trump to try to bully the Ukrainians into accepting the bad ceasefire and the elections. The mineral deal is in and of itself just PR. What Trump has wanted to do is force a bad ceasefire on Ukraine and get rid of the Ukrainian government and destabilize the Ukrainian government. That's what the mineral deal was part of, was a way to bully Trump. And he actually said that in the confrontation with Zelensky in the Oval Office. If you read the last thing he said, you agree to the ceasefire. They're first talking about the mineral deal, but then he goes, agree to the ceasefire. So they're trying to force a really bad deal on Ukraine. My own view is that the future of Ukraine is the future of Europe. That's what it is. What happens to Ukraine will determine the future of Europe. It depends whether the kind of Europe that we have seen since 1945 can actually endure. And if it can endure, it'll need Ukraine integrated into it.
From the history perspective, because I want a bit of the inspiration, let's say like that. I don't know, positive examples, maybe negative examples. Would you tell us, the cases when countries under this pressure made it? And thanks to what they've made it?
Well, Vietnam. What Vietnam is able to do is one, it keeps the fighting going. It inflicts losses on the other side that the other side ultimately decides they can't keep. First the French and then the U.S. They also, by the way, get a lot of support. So it's about getting support for that fight. The Vietnamese had a lot of support from the Russians, Soviets. So, there are certain lessons that need to be learned. What the Ukrainians have to do is keep inflicting high losses on the Russians while maintaining low losses for themselves and keeping the support of crucial international partners. And right now that's Europe. So, and if they can do that, by the way, the lessons are Ukraine should win, or at least come out of this war in pretty good shape, because Europe's much larger economically than Russia. Many more people, much greater production. Higher technology base. So you would say that actually, even without the U.S., if Europe fully commits to Ukraine, the European states, Germany, France, the UK, Poland, the Nordics, whatever, that actually is a winning recipe against Russia, which isn't economically that strong.
So who are the kind of strong military powers in Europe? Because it's not always the big countries with a big economy.
Well, and Poland has the largest land army, without a doubt. The Poles are spending 5% of their GDP on defense. It's also who has the ability to spend and build a lot. The Germans have an enormous ability to spend because they have had these very tight budget rules. So in many ways, the Germans are going to have to be the real engine going forwards. Yeah, the British and the French are still far larger economies than the Russians. The Nordics are also willing to spend a lot on defense. So there's a significant well of resources there. It just has to be actually spent. And people have to commit to spending.
On more negative note, if there is no other way but some kind of type of the ceasefire, this can happen. What are also the modalities? Because, there was in the end the Finland, which, I'm speaking about the Finnish-Soviet war. Yes, they kind of won, but also they were pushed to this type of neutrality. There was a ceasefire in South Korea, which never ended into the end of the conflict. But of course, there was a guarantee of thousands of the, American troops on the ground.
Then Ukraine has to play the longer game. And the longer game is quite clear. Say there's a ceasefire on the present line of contact, which is actually a problem because Ukraine occupies parts of Kursk. So there'll have to be, you would assume, some kind of adjustment to the line of contact. But say the Ukrainians pull out of Kursk and the Russians pull out of parts of the Donbass and you reach a ceasefire, which is basically close to the present line. And the Europeans want to enforce that because they don't want to go back to war with the U.S. out. That two things have to happen for Ukraine to come through this in the medium long term. One, there has to be then an absolute clear path to EU membership. And by the way, the quest for NATO membership is gone because NATO won't exist. So in many ways, it's simpler, at least, because there's going to be a European defense structure, not a NATO, and Ukraine has to get into that European defense structure, and it has to get into the European Union. At the same time, what Ukraine can't do is recognize Russian legitimacy in the occupied areas. They have to say, okay, there is a ceasefire line. We understand that. We're not going to go to war right now. However, we are maintaining our absolutely valid international legal claims to all the ground of Ukraine as recognized in 1991. And that will put Russia in the longer term in a real problem if they ever want to get back to having good relations with Europe. Because Ukraine in the EU, in the European defense structure, with an actual legal claim to the Crimea and the Donbass, puts Russia in a real problem. It will take time for that problem to be manifest, but that is the longer-term solution. The nightmare, of course, is that the ceasefire happens, Ukraine isn't put in the EU and isn't put in the European defense structure. So you have to play different kinds of scenarios in your mind. Ultimately, though, the key thing for Ukraine will be integrated into European structures as full members. And then that puts Russia in a huge bind. Absolutely massive bind. Because if they're going to go back to war with Ukraine in the future, they're going to go back to war with all of Europe. That would be, I think, what happens if you have a bad ceasefire enforced now. The price for that bad ceasefire will have to be Ukrainian integration into the EU.
After this meeting in the Oval Office, I had a message from the colleague who is based in Tehran, who said, even Iranians know you can't trust Russia. What the hell they are doing. But I want to have a larger question. Within this short period of time, you kind of said, that the US isn't really seen as a trustworthy partner for Europeans. What is your opinion? How does Ukraine and the US, how do they look for, countries like Turkey, the countries who are somewhere in between? How actually, this whole meeting with Zelensky, what the case, if we speak about strategy of the wars and geopolitics, what that case showed to the countries which are not obvious Ukrainian supporters, which didn't speak, but how kind of it looks if you zoom out a bit globally?
Well, I think it looks now that the U.S. has abandoned Ukraine. So I don't think there's any doubt that that's what it looks like now and that Trump is siding with Putin. So I think for the rest of the world, they have gotten that message. I don't think the rest of the world matters a great deal. I think Europe matters. As I said, I don't think, say, what happens in much of the global south will make a difference in this endgame. What will matter will be whether Europe wishes to understand that Ukraine is central to Europe's future and fight the war along those lines.
Yeah, I still would ask, it doesn't matter maybe their input, but their opinion and their view, because it's still kind of on the matter of the level of the narrative. Where now US stands in this world? Where does Ukraine stands in this world? How they are? I know it might be changed in a month after we, translated this podcast into Ukrainian, and things might change, but still, if it's historic, let's make a guess, maybe too ambitious, how that would be historically recorded, not just for Europe and Ukraine.
I think it'll be recorded as part of the end of the European North Atlantic Alliance. What we are seeing basically is the end of, as I said, the post-1945 world. It's over, which was based on U.S. leadership to provide security to Europe. And that's not coming back. And so the question is, what comes after that? And the big question we don't know is whether Europe rallies together or falls apart. And both are still possible.